Have you been watching the hit animated Christian-made streaming show? No, the other one, the Wingfeather Saga. No doubt you've heard of the best-selling fantasy series by singer-songwriter Andrew Peterson. This story of the Igby family's darkly whimsical journey has attracted legions of readers from all ages. Now it's become a streaming series distributed by Angel Studios. Today, the executive producer and animation director Keith Lango visits our studio to share more about the origins of this animated story. Welcome back to Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm Stephen Burnett, the publisher, co-author of The Pop Culture Parent, and a recent failed actor. I tried my hand, or my voice rather, at voice acting. I wanted to play one of the fangs of Dang, but I will say that it was not the best thing to try for my vocal cords.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and I've just gotten back from one of my favorite places to visit, which is a bookstore. And in this case, it's the Books and Crannies bookstore in the Glipwood Township on the continent of Scree. And this is episode 146, How Did Animators Adapt the Wingfeather Saga for Streaming TV? And we'll be joined by Keith Lango.
Keith Lango actually has a bit of a past, however brief, with the website before Lorehaven. Back in 2016 is when he and some other animation allies got together to fundraise for the original animated short, kind of a proof of concept for the Wingfeather Saga series. It has been nearly 7 years since then, and now the first season is airing on the Angel Studios app. That's where you can also get The Chosen and a lot of other entertainment from Christians and otherwise. Really wholesome stuff there, but as you'll hear him say in the conversation, it's not always safe, but it is good. So, of course, that is just where we live here at Fantastical Truth. And I would say, Zach, having seen some of the animated show already, yeah, those fangs are not safe. They go around like this, and they have these voices that, as I said earlier, are not healthy for the vocal cords. There's also a lot of slime involved, a lot of venomous drooling going on, which is just not wholesome at all.
Yeah, so my middle daughter described the Wingfeather series as silly and scary all at once. And I thought that was a really good way to summarize it, that there are so many funny jokes. There's a lot of kind of gross kind of humor about stinky things. But then there are some scary parts with the fangs and trying to capture or eat or kill the children. They're this occupying force. And so there's a lot of political and military kind of tension happening. There's a lot of sadness, it seems like, throughout the story. And I just really am so intrigued by this, Stephen, that it's not what I thought it would be, which is, the silly kind of snake from the Disney Robin Hood, the sidekick of
Prince John.
Yes.
Yeah,
that guy. I that's kind of what I went in expecting, was some kind of snake character like that. And yeah, there is some kind of silly elements like that, but there's definitely some serious danger.
Yes, Zach, the fangs of Dang are legitimately scary, and for those of you who believe in this conspiracy theory, you may want to update it. In this world, Ariar, I believe it's called, the lizard people have cast off the human suits, and they're just acting out in the open. They're great villains for the show, and yet they also strain the voice just a little bit. So if you've got, I'd say, older kids, definitely a show to check out. It's beautifully made. I'm loving the music of this. I have not even read the book yet. I'm definitely going to, but we want to stump as much as we can for excellent Christian fantasy. A lot of it in book form, of course, if you listen to this podcast, but in this case, kind of special, really, getting a 6-episode show. And then listen to the end of this conversation with Keith to get an update about season 2.
Stephen, the other thing I just really liked about this element of the fangs is, I mentioned they're occupying this town and I guess the whole continent of Scree. And it just harkens back to how C.S. Lewis talked about in Mere Christianity. We are living in enemy-occupied territory. I think a lot of people have felt this in recent years with certain shifts in our culture. We're not going to go into culture war stuff. But we've all felt that our whole lives, that there is something very twisted and broken and about this world. There's a parasitic, almost force at work. And it's visualized very well in these fangs. Like, no one likes them. And what they like is very twisted. The mother gives this kind of head fang, whatever his title is. She gives him a box full of really smelly, worms and maggots. I think she calls it maggot loaf instead of meatloaf, and he's just chomping into it. He just loves it. And basically, they have to pay a tribute to these guys to be able to go to their festival and just move freely. Right away, that resonated with me. I wasn't sure what I was going to think about these fangs because, again, back to my daughter saying silly, it's scary. They're kind of scary, and that there were a couple times where our kids we were watching this and they just sort of recoiled. They're like, "Oh, I know what's going to happen." Like, "Oh, yeah, looking through my fingers, like it's a little scary." But I really like this as a kids show. You have to know your own kid. You have to know their comfort level with scary things. But boy, there is so much going on just in the first 2 episodes that it's this giant world with tons of things going on.
Sounds like we may have a new Christian classic fantasy on our hands. And speaking of classic Christian fantasy, as well as reptiles with unusual features, that brings me to our first sponsor for this episode, the new publisher from Oasis Family Media, Sky Turtle Press, and their new fundraiser for a prose adaptation of the classic Edmund Spenser epic poem from the 1590s, The Fairy Queen. C.S. Lewis once said, "The Fairy Queen never loses a reader it has once gained. Once you have become an inhabitant of its world, being tired of it is like being tired of London or of life." Welcome to Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, the new text-faithful, line-by-line prose rendering of Spenser's epic poem, introduces new readers to Spenser's enthralling world of monsters, enchanted forests, witches, and brave but fumbling knights. To help readers overcome this struggle, classical educator Rebecca K. Reynolds worked with Elizabethan scholars to produce an annotated rendering which moves from heavy assistance in Book 1 toward more of Spenser's language in Book 6. This week's episode is sponsored by Sky Turtle Press, the publishers of Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen. They have launched their Kickstarter last week, just a day before we did our interview with Rebecca Reynolds herself for episode 145. And they're going to release this book and other products in September of this year, 2023. Zach, we were just looking at the fundraiser earlier. They had an initial goal of $7,500. That was met on the first day. And as we're recording, they're quickly approaching a $60,000 goal, and they've unlocked some other stretch goals. And looks like we're going to get some beautiful gift sets of the Fairy Queen starting in the fall of this year.
It's incredible to see that go forward. And I love all these illustrations they've done. And man, what a common theme with what we're talking about today, just these beautifully illustrated stories. You're going to hear in a minute Keith talk about the approach that they use. It's a little different than you might expect from a animation that's being made in 2022, 2023. And he uses this phrase, handcrafted television show. And he's going to share more about what that means and kind of how that works out. Now, to you, our listener, you may notice that as we go into our, what we're going to call our backup studio with Keith, we're going to sound a little bit different. So please bear with us as Keith will share. A lot of times you're having to create things in mid-flight. So hope you still enjoy this conversation.
There's a classic animated short, the second one of Wallace and Gromit from Aardman Animation in the UK, where Gromit, a claymation dog, is throwing little model train tracks down right in front of the speeding model locomotive. Sometimes I'm sure that's how it feels when you're running an animation studio as well as a podcast studio. By the way, Zach, I'm glad you said that about fantasy that looks and feels a little different. There's kind of a developing theme here, so that's why we're actually retconning our last episode with Rebecca and the Fairy Queen and this episode, and I think the next, into an ongoing series of the podcast we're going to call Forging Fantasy. So it's just a little different take on fantasy, some different things that creators are trying for the glory of God to make these excellent stories. By the way, I think I hear a caw that makes me feel a little nervous. So let's see how Keith Lango is entering the studio. Keith Lango is both a student and instructor in the art of animation and its technology. His passion for developing engaging experiences in animation has given him a wide and varying experience in the field and was fundamental to the creation of the Wingfeather Saga's distinct animation style. He has worked on 3-2-1 Penguins, VeggieTales, and at Valve Corporation on video games like Portal 2. He's an executive producer and animation director for the Wingfeather Saga, And right now, he is circling high above the black carriage, caw-cawing as a herald of doom. Keith, welcome to the Lorehaven studio.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Now, you wear a lot of hats for the Wingfeather Saga. I saw in the opening credits of the first episode, at least, not only animation director, CG supervisor, executive producer. Did I get those right, or are there any other titles I need to add?
Yeah, there's so many things under what I do because we're a small, scrappy startup that we've kind of settled on. My son calls me the Lord and Master of all pixels. In my Slack channel, I think I have a grand poobah of pixels. So basically, if it's on screen, for the most part, I've had a hand in how it gets there through all the different departments. But um, yeah, so that's why we just kind of lumped it under CG and animation. Basically, if you see it, it's under my stuff. Now, I don't do it personally, but help develop the style and kind of like the whole philosophy of how we do our animation and looking into, can we do things differently? Instead of the standard Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks style that's been very lucrative, but also gobstoppingly expensive. So when you're a scrappy little startup working with crowdfunding money, you got to find ways to maximize your funds for the best viewer experience, for the audience. So we lean into a bunch of different things that are not your normal Pixar style of things, but uh, that's actually it's by design. We go, hey, let's do things differently. Looking at entertainment as a vehicle, Pixar and Disney, they make automobiles, great cars, equate it to Mercedes or something like that. Very expensive car. You get in it, oh, this is a very nice car. And then everybody else keeps trying to make Mercedes type things with, Kia budgets. Uh, and so if you got it, and we're not even a Kia budget, we're just like, we're like a used Hyundai budget. And you get in there and you're like, okay, this is not the same experience. You can feel the corners being cut and it just, you come away thinking, okay, well, I got to where I was going, but that wasn't as nice an experience. So philosophically, we're like, well, how about if we make a really, really nice motorcycle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You still get, it's still a transportation thing, but it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. And then there's a lot of things that if you change your philosophy and your mindset and your goals about what you're making, there's a lot of things you don't need to build. Like you don't need to make an air conditioner. You don't need to make power windows. You don't need to make a trunk. There's a lot of aspects of what goes into making a car that you just can't do without, even on the cheapest ones, and they just add price and cost. And you're just checking boxes, but you're doing it to such a minimal level that it's not very compelling experience. So we're just like, let's make a different experience that's still entertaining, still beautiful, and still compelling as a story. Because really, it's about the story. Everything else is, serves that. But if the story's not good, it doesn't matter what you do with it. But we know we have a great story. So now it's just like, okay, let's take the ethos of what that story is about and let's find a way to express it in how it looks and let's bring some handcrafted beauty to this thing because there's something about the world of J.R.R. that feels handcrafted and beautiful.
So before you were making the used Hyundai version of animation, and before you were building puzzles in Portal 2 and reminding us, the cake is a lie, going all the way back a little bit further in your life, how did you originally discover fantastical stories and biblical truth?
I guess like for most folks that goes back to my early teen years. Just stumbled into stuff like The Hobbit when I was like maybe 10 or 11 years old and just became fascinated with it. Read it through a couple of times. Through many of those years, just kind of absorbed that stuff, then absorbed the Narnia stuff when my girls were younger, just reading through with them and getting captivated by that kind of magical world. But the idea that there's things that there's a resonance to them. Currents run deep. They're
Mm-hmm.
moving and they're compelling and they're profound, but they're not preachy or anything like that. It's just if you look for it, you can find the allegories, and you don't have to look that hard in Narnia. But you can see the value, not the values, because that's such a dumb word, like family values. Like I don't know, that's just morality policing. No, there's something very very deep and compelling, and like it stirs the soul kind of stuff. And I remember that being pretty profound at the time, and it really motivated a lot of what I want to do with my life as far as like trying to tell stories like that. Went into animation because I seem to have a knack for it. um, and when it comes to faith, I grew up in in the home of a divorced, excommunicated Catholic. Um, so really wasn't much church life early years. But then my parents kind of found their way and went to church and stuff like that. And there was a profound change in my dad, really quite a bit, around age 11 or 12, same time actually. Went from being a hard drinking, very angry guy who was not exactly the nicest guy to be around to being, clean, sober, jovial, kind. And it's like,
Oh
wait,
wow.
what? So kind of profound transformation that, before he passed away, we had a really fantastic relationship and it was just great, so there's a lot of redemption in that. So
Praise God.
when you're that age and you kind of see, all my life up till now, up until age 11 or so has been, well, dad's drinking, let's stay quiet and out of the way, to, hey, home is a safe place now, is like, it's pretty compelling message to a young person about what it means to find something deeper that pulls you out of something, that pulls you into something else.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a full character arc then in your dad's life.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, once you see a redemption story like that, it is very difficult to unsee. It is near miraculous to see how our great Savior can take a heart of stone and swap it out for a heart of flesh. Keith, I really appreciated too. You're almost a Jerry Gord like voice there, or is it Jimmy Gord? I forget. Family values. Like, okay, it does
uh,
sound a little Christianese. A word I have found myself using more in place of that is a little bit more retro sounding word, which is virtue. You've got Christ
sure,
likeness on display, not only in the redemption arc of a loved one, but in these fantastical stories that aren't just talking about it's good to be good, so that's why you should, or being nice. Watching the
yeah,
first episode of the Wingfeather Saga, I mean, I guess you could say it's family values, but I'm just seeing a very in depth virtue there. The family is clearly being drawn into a larger story, a battle of good versus evil, with all of these townspersons being ruled over by the fangs of Dang. By the way, if you hear
yeah.
any stress in my voice, that's because I was actually auditioning to perform as one of the fangs, and a little bit difficult on the vocal cords there. Or it could be allergy season here in Central Texas. So, jumping then to the chapter one proper of our discussion, I'm curious then, Keith, what led you from enjoying these stories and then seeing this providential redemption at home? What led you to help create these animated stories as an animator, supervisor, executive producer, and all the rest of it?
Specifically on Wingfeather.
Or just all together, 321 Penguins, VeggieTales, Valve, all this
Yeah,
stuff.
all that stuff. I kind of stumbled into. I mean, I was always an artist, kind of, but not a really good one, in a writer, but not bad at it. But there was no mechanism for me to kind of follow through on that. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. It's at the time, a dying steel town. If you're an artist, then, it's a town of manufacturing, blue collar all the way through, right? And my dad had this saying. He's like, they call them starving artists for a reason, son. You might want to find a real job. Uh, so, I never, like, you grow up in a town like that, so disconnected from the world of media and what that means. It's like human beings don't make movies. I mean, you stop and think about it logically. Of course, human beings make movies, but not real human beings. It's just like you're being an astronaut or the president. Yes, I suppose technically that's a human. That's not a regular person, right? That's not for me. It's not within the realm of possibility of, like, that's something I could do. So I never dreamed of, like, I'm not one of these kids who grew up like I dreamed of working at Disney since the time I was 10 years old. No, I had no clue. I didn't know. So I stumbled into it completely by accident. Mostly got started into doing for sale by owner real estate magazine from a friend of mine who said, "Hey, I got a landscaping business and you're pretty artistic, and how about I go around and sell the ads and you put the paper together?" And I said, "Okay, cool. I that sounds interesting." Um, I got better at putting together a paper than he did at selling ads, so we went out of business pretty quick. But from that, I leveraged the skills I learned, and I learned them the hard way by making mistake after mistake after mistake. So much so that 3 of the 4 service bureaus in the town of Rochester, New York, would no longer accept me as a client because my stuff was so broken.
Oh,
Oh,
Um, they're like, "Don't ever come back here again. You don't know what you're doing." I'm like, "Of course I don't know what I'm doing. I'm going to go to the next people until I burn out their goodwill." But I learned, right, the hard way doing it. And this is early '90s, so there wasn't really an internet. And so you just kind of get by, And then I was at leveraged that to work at a Gannett newspaper in Rochester, New York, the Democratic Chronicle, and so it's a big paper in town. I was in the ad department, and when I was there, one of the coworkers who was, I don't know, kind of a high nose snob, but he just had graduated from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He showed me a 3D render about the size of a postage stamp of a golden Tutankhamun head that he had made for like one of his classes. I said, "How in the world did you do that? It's so compelling." And he's like, "Well, just you." And he tried to big time me because back then, if you had, it was like a secret knowledge. If you know 3D animation, you didn't bother to share the secrets with the hoi polloi. But I dug around a little bit and found out, okay, these software. So my wife was just graduated from school. It was my turn, quote unquote, to go to school. We had two young ones at home, and I said, I think I want to do this. And instead of going to school and taking out a loan, I'm going to go ahead and take out a loan for a computer for some software, and I'm going to dive in, and I'll be a stay-at-home dad who learns how to do this stuff. And I give myself 4 years to get good at it, and that's what I did. And along the way, I got clients and got better. And when I saw Toy Story, I said, now there's a thing I think I could do. So then I started animating with software that was not designed to be animated. So much so that the creators of the software said, "Who gave you our new beta version for this?" Because I did an animation test and put it up on like an AOL server or something. And they're like, "You can't do what you just did with our existing software. So who gave you the access to the beta? Because they're not supposed to do that." I said, "Bro, I don't know what you're talking about. I just use your software." And they're like, we don't know how you did that. We don't believe you. Send us the files. So I sent them the files, and they're like, "Oh, you're clever." So they started putting me onto beta programs, and that's kind of how I got my break into it. I just realized I have a knack for just taking what exists and hacking it to get the results that we're after. And Wingfeather is just one big, long journey from that point, where we take what's existing and say, what if we use it differently? So somebody, I was doing another interview, and somebody said, "Hey, so what's your job like?" I said, "Our job in the animation department for Wingfeather Saga." Did you know the movie Apollo 13, where they have to create the CO2 filter,
right,
or the carbon monoxide
round
filter?
bag into a square hole or something? Yeah,
tell me this isn't a
where the
government
engineer
operation.
down on the ground just says, "We got to make one of these out of all of that on the table." Right?
I love
That's
that
our
scene.
job. Yeah, just so that our job is to just take what's available and make something different out of it. So make something new. So we're doing that. We're creating all this rich artistic painterly style in Unreal Engine in real time, which is a massive game changer as far as like what it costs to turn things around. Our iteration levels go way up, and there's a lot of benefit from it. So I'm starting to get into the weeds, so I'm going to stop there.
Well, I'd love to get in the weeds with you just a little bit about the style. Occasionally, I will watch YouTube videos and such about animation, computer graphics, and such. And I grew up keeping up with Pixar. I was well aware of Toy Story when it was coming out before 1995. And then, of course, right about the same time, or even just a few years earlier, you've got Phil Vischer and Mike Naraki working up in Illinois, got a hold of their own animation software, trying to make cartoons with not talking candy bars, but talking vegetables. We had Mike
I think
Naraki.
they should have done the candy bars.
Yeah, maybe someone. Apparently, the candy bar verse is still up for grabs. If any,
I told Mike he should have done that.
Yeah, I think parents would have loved it. You've already gone over some of the least glamorous parts of getting into this business, animation. Obviously, there's an uphill climb simply because we live in a groaning world and there's some practical needs. You got to eat, you got to take care of your family, and animation is not the quickest way to do that. What though is like the most fulfilling part of this job to you, and not only as an animator, but as a Christ follower? Like what does it do to create stuff, new kinds of images in this way?
Gosh, it's just fun. It's really fun when you make something and you just try your best to make it what your heart and what your mind thinks it should be. And you don't always hit it. You're lucky if you hit the dartboard. Bullseyes are pretty rare. But what you do is, for me anyways, the act of creating is so fun. It's the journey, not the destination most of the time. This is a weird thing. I don't really watch a bunch of movies. I don't read a ton of books. I tell my friends, like, "Hey man, I don't use the drugs. I just sell them. I make them, So
physician heal thyself. That's funny.
Yeah, I'm just really big into making things. That's just where I feel like solving the problem. It's just I feel like I'm a fish who's in water. So in that way, I feel like I'm honoring my creator in that regard. He made me to do this, so I should probably just do it as well as I can, and enjoy it, and try to bring and unlock some mystery, some beauty in the world in doing it. And so that's really rewarding from a personal standpoint. In my position now, my most rewarding thing is my team. We have a lot of young folks on our crew because we're startup, right? And the passion and energy they have, and seeing them grow and take on new roles, and like our assembly team, like they're we break it apart into different groups and departments and stuff like that. So the people who take all the animation and all the paintings and all the various pieces and put them together inside of the Unreal Engine, and then adjust the lights and the colors and everything like that, and really just do the final dressing so that what you see is the image you see. That entire team is mostly under the age of 23.
Oh wow.
Um, and they're so brilliant, and so they're sharp and they're bright, and they don't have to be untaught ways because they're new. So they're just like, okay, you teach me how to do this. And so they're so adept at learning new things, and they surprise me every day. And I have a really strong sense of pride that we're I'm kind of like mentoring the thing. I'm like, teaching has always been a big part of my journey as well in all of this. I've developed a fairly solid reputation as a teacher of animation. Most of the time, if you Google my name, it's half the time it's going to come up as the courses and stuff like that I've taught. And I had my own business for a number of years when I lived in Brazil to teach animation online and stuff like that. After I'd kind of gotten burned out on the studios, and I just love teaching, the act of teaching, and helping unlock things for people. That's, to me, it's an extension of what creating is. And if I had to kind of coalesce it all into a single statement, I like being able to pull back the curtains to something and letting people see it. Like, whether that's explaining things or teaching things or making something visual or anything, just kind of, it's obscured. I can't see it. And in some way, finding a way to unlock the padlock that has kind of kept it away from us, and opening those doors and letting that light in is really, really fun to me. So that's what I really dig.
Backing up for just a second, tell me how many people are on your animation team and where are y'all located?
We are located all over the place. We have probably 20-ish full-time employees, and much like the rest of the animation business, we kind of ramp people on and off on contract based off of where we're at in the production cycle. At the peak, we had probably 75 people at the same time. If you added up all of the folks who had worked on season one of Wingfeather Saga, it's probably well over 100 by now. But we don't have an office. We don't have a studio. Chris Walls, he's the other co-founder and executive producer. His bonus room upstairs is about the closest thing we have to a corporate headquarters. Um, I work out of my home in Spokane, and I have two young fellows there who work with me doing, you know, camera layout, cinematography, and then assembly. Our animation crew, we have some U.S. based animators, but most of them are based out of Europe. And I got a crew of guys out of Vienna. We got folks out of Prague. Um, got a guy in Scotland. We have two guys in Turkey. Just all over the place. And that's one of the benefits of being able to do things now is a lot of folks are used to working from home because of the pandemic, and we can kind of leverage that thing, and so we don't have to spend money on office space and things like that. And the other thing is, it allows us to find people who are aligned, with what we're trying to accomplish. They're not all believers, but not by a long shot. But a lot of them feel a resonance with the stories, and that's a big tribute to Andrew and the stories he wrote. Um, Someone described Wingfeather Saga as not obviously Christian, but profoundly Christian. We love that. In fact, struggle in our that's a big struggle for our existence as a property in the marketplace. Chris calls it the middle space. We're not trying to be a Christian property. We're not trying to be a secular property. We want to ride that line where Andrew's books have lived. The growth of the Wingfeather Saga as a book series, they just recently crossed 1 million books sold, which is fantastic. his books have not gained their popularity in Christian bookstores. That's been at the Barnes and Nobles and the Amazons and just normal mainstream marketplace. And that's where we want this show to live because, not for nothing, we just don't want to preach to the choir. It's not our gig. So we'll do things like Lord of the Rings that are profoundly Christian and definitely express a Christian worldview because that's who we are. But it's not like we're trying to turn this into a chick tract.
Right. There are stories that Christians can enjoy and that non-Christians can enjoy simply because we are living in God's universe. That is the thing we have in common. There are going to be themes of good versus evil, beauty versus ugliness, truth versus lies that do have universal appeal. And sometimes, as C.S. Lewis said, it takes a particular kind of a sneaky knight to creep past those watchful dragons, in Lewis's word. Great fantasy can come from everywhere. It can start as a song or a book and might even become an animated series. We're going back to the bookshelf for our second sponsor for this episode. It is Jamie Foley, the author of the Sentinel Trilogy series. This young adult sci-fi/fantasy series has been called Harry Potter in a Left Behind story. In a world where spiritual gifts are manifested physically, characters must learn to use their unique abilities at the Saren Academy. When the apocalypse begins, will they work together to survive or be captured and enslaved? Written for teenage boys, this completed trilogy is full of humor and action. Book 1, Sentinel, has over 100 reviews on Amazon with a 4.4 star average and is available now for Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. That is author Jamie Foley with the Sentinel Trilogy series. You can find more information in our show notes for 146 or go to lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors. Keith, you perfectly set up our second chapter of this discussion. How did you personally discover the Wingfeather Saga from singer-songwriter Andrew Peterson and get involved with this animated project? Because you've been involved with this at least 7 years. We have an older article that you wrote. Thank you for the Speculative Faith website, predecessor to Lorehaven, in which you were talking about the fundraising for the original animated short. So this has been going on at least 7 years for you, long before the first episode arrives at the Angel Studio streaming site.
Welcome to Hollywood development, man.
That's a 7-year tribulation. Yes.
Yeah. So I first met Andrew not because I was, familiar with his music, but because, Chris. I've known Chris Wall a long time because we worked together on stuff with VeggieTales. I was a Chicago iteration of Big Idea, and then when they had the big bankruptcy and got sold, and they moved to Nashville, I moved on to do other things in my career. And Chris was Nashville Big Idea. But as would happen, as they're making shows, they would call me back to kind of consult and help do things because, by the time I left Chicago, I was, director of studio operations for CG. So I kind of knew, they're like, Keith knows how to make veggies, right? So as they're kind of getting stuff ready for overseas studios to execute on, they're like, I was contracted as a consulting. So anyways, I got to know Chris at Nashville Big Idea in the early 2000s and really struck up a good friendship and a good working relationship. Like we work really well together. And so Chris had worked with Andrew on, and I think also Randall Good Game on a Silly Song. So they had developed their thing. And then around 2007, 2008, Chris left Big Idea the first time because something, I think it was they're being sold or something. And he had optioned the rights to a children's illustrated book, and he was going to try and turn it into a film. And he had partnered up with Andrew to write the screenplay. And of course, Chris was wanting me to do on that show or on that movie what we're doing with Wingfeather, the same painted animation style to try and, make the most out of things and do something different. Because I've been studying this kind of style for 20 years and doing lots of different tests. And so anyways, I met Andrew just on that. We got to know each other mostly just because we're going to work on developing a film together. And we're doing okay, talking to a bunch of monkey mucks with money, and it was looking like it was going someplace. And of course, 2008 happened, and everybody said, "Oh, what money? What's that?" But that's where I got to know Andrew and become a friend. And he had just finished his first book, and So he hadn't even finished all of it yet. So through the years, just kept up with Chris, and occasionally with Andrew and stuff. And so in the summer of 2015, after Andrew had finished the fourth book, um, he came to Chris and said, "Hey, what do you think about making this a TV show, kind of like Airbender, the Avatar, the Last Airbender?" And Chris was like, "That's pretty cool." So first thing Chris did was call me and say, "Hey, Andrew says he'd like to make a TV show out of the Wingfeather Saga, and want to know if you'd be in on it." I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it." So the Wingfeather Saga came later for me than Andrew. Like I knew him before that, just through different things.
So what was the challenge then turning this into a multi-episode show? The first three episodes are already out, by the way, and I think I saw episode 4 is arriving on February the 10th. That's a big production. You've got to find voice talent. You've got to adapt the book to the screen. No easy process, especially when folks are
Right.
getting very, very attached to the way that the books are written. And from what I've seen
Yep.
so far, at least, the first episode starts a little differently from the book. There's a lot more early world building in the book, but you have to begin with a galloping horse and the carriage and the thunder, and then a rather startling, but still child appropriate abduction at the beginning of the very first episode. What do you recall, like maybe the top 3 or even the top 1 challenges of bringing the Wingfeather Saga from the page to the screen?
From an adaptation standpoint, I mean, there's a lot of technical challenges that may or may not be interesting. Just getting a studio stood up with no time, that right there was like, hey, we went to the crowd, we got the crowdfunding, raised our $5 million to make our first season. First off, the idea of making a season of 6 episodes and starting a studio and doing all the pre-production for just $5 million is
Just 5
insane.
million. Yes, we're used to seeing Disney spend hundreds of millions of dollars on an animated film, whether or not it does very well.
Right.
That's astounding.
Yeah. And so we had 18 months from the money hits the bank to, okay, we got to have episodes. Okay, well, who do you have? Nobody. What tech do you have? None. What's your pipeline? Don't have one. Where's your studio? Don't have one. So it's been a scramble. The biggest challenge for the past year and a half is just getting it all stood up, getting systems built, getting pipelines built, getting people trained up, being able to find all the problems and work around them. So from that standpoint, there's just a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of hard work to kind of, as I mentioned to some people, it's like taking all the parts of an airplane, putting it into a catapult, launching it in the air, and hoping you can assemble a plane that can land safely before it all crashes to the ground. So,
Wow.
and we've landed that plane. Our episode 1 took our animation team, I want to say close to 4 or 5 months to animate, probably 5 months, just episode 1, because we're just learning so many things, running into so many problems, having to build so many systems, having to get their heads around how they animate this way. And then by the time we finished, we just wrapped up episode 6 animation, so the animators are kind of on a break right now, but we were able to do episode 5 in like 5 weeks with the same crew. And the same thing is assembly. Our first putting the show together, like gathering all the pieces and putting the final image together on episode 1 was like a 4-month arduous process of pain and sorrow. And now we can assemble a show in about 4 weeks, same size crew. So the efficiencies are there. Like just getting past all those things was really, really big. From an adaptation standpoint, the big thing, and this is really interesting, probably more to your readers or your listeners, is from the literary adaptation, is trying to give the kids agency in book 1. Andrew's like, hey, it was my first book, man. Go easy on me. And we're like, well, yeah, we know, but from story development, we understand that your characters have to have agency. And much of what happens in book 1 is Deus Ex Machina. The kids things are happening to them, but they're rescued. Pete rescues, and there's always somebody coming in, and so they're just kind of they're along for the ride. But there isn't a lot of instances in book 1 where the children make a choice because of the situation presented to them, and that choice has consequences, which then they have to follow up on or whatever. So, in order to make to kind of correct for that error, the other was that Lily is just in book 1, she's not really a developed character. She's just a bigger version of Nugget, right? She just goes along for the ride on this stuff, and it's really a story about the brothers. And so we felt like to make this show really work for girls, we need to give Lily far more activity. So we spent a lot of time working through that. And it wasn't just this year; it was like through the intervening 7 years when we're working on adapting the thing first to series, and then we weren't getting anywhere with series, so we thought maybe we'd do a feature film. So we then, adapted it to film, and then back to series again. There was always this effort on our part to really push and give the kids more agency, so that their decisions have actions and consequences. And then Lily is not just a passenger, but she's an active participant in the entire adventure.
Yeah, one of my favorite scenes so far is when they're standing. Well, spoiler alert here, folks, if you haven't seen it. They're standing by the cliffside, and the sea dragons arrive, and Lily starts to sing, and then we see sort of this awakening of supernatural gifts in each of the three Igby family children. That's where I think, to me, the first episode goes from good to great, because we are feeling that sense of virtue you mentioned earlier, that longing for some kind of beauty that is being suppressed by the evil in the world. So I'm glad that y'all had made that decision. There's so much good music too in the show, which of course,
Oh
coming
yeah,
from Andrew Peterson, one might expect. I did not expect him himself to be a guest voice, basically seeming to play a fantasy world version of himself. But in retrospect, well, why would I not expect that? I've only seen the first
yeah,
episode so far, Keith, by the way, and I've not yet read the book. Don't tell anyone. It's just you and me here. But I'm really enjoying it, and it makes me want then to head into the audiobook for the first book, which I own, On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness. So 6 episodes then. So we have 3 out, and then the second half of the first season is coming out starting on February the 10th. So you said that the animation team has gotten to have a break now, but you yourself have been scrambling here. So it's really great that you're able to clear time for the interview this morning. Whether your favorite fantasy story is made by Christians or made by others who still know how to make great stories, your call, especially if you're a parent, is to discern and explore these stories for the glory of God and teach your children to do the same. That leads me to our third sponsor for this episode, and it be in part myself. I grabbed the open slot, at least for the next few episodes and this one. It is my nonfiction book, The Pop Culture Parent, co-written with my friends Ted Turneau and Dr. Jared Moore. Ted does worldview teaching, Jared does pastoring, and I do the story stuff, and we all do the story stuff for this book. It is a nonfiction book, but there is a dragon on the cover, so it fits with the theme. It helps you to engage these stories, not just to identify the parts of the stories that might be displeasing to God, but the idols in the stories and the beauties and goodness and truths in these stories. It is your job as a parent to approach these as a shepherd who's training your children to look out for the idols in the world that come out of their hearts that the world can then endorse through these stories, but then also find the goodness in these stories that reflects the goodness, the fingerprints that still exist in God's world. And then, most importantly, using these and other questions we've developed to bring the gospel into the discussion. Where is Jesus glimpsed in the story, or where is his handiwork glimpsed in the story, whether or not the creators have put it there? And then how can Jesus alone answer and fulfill the good longings that the stories stir up in our hearts? We've been talking with Keith about the longings that the Wingfeather Saga book and animated series stirs up in our hearts with the music and that sense of a world that is made better, that no longer has fangs prowling around. A book like this may be what you need to help your kids learn to identify and name these things and glorify Jesus as a result of their engagement with these stories. You can get more information in our show notes for episode 146, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors and learn more about the pop culture parent. I guess we can go ahead and move into chapter 3 then. What is next for the Wingfeather Saga, and anything else that your studio is going to do involving maybe Angel Studios as well?
yeah. Well, when I say animation, to the layperson, that means anybody who's making visual stuff. In technical terms, I'm just talking about the people who make the performances. Our background painters are still very busy. Our assembly people are busy. There's a whole lot of people still working. We're like, episode 4 is due, what you said, February 10th.
It's what I saw from
There's
IMDb anyway. Says it's coming out Friday, February
awesome.
the
Yeah, so
10th. Yes.
that's when it's coming out, and there's about 100 shots on my hard drive at home that need to get fixed before that goes out the door. And today is not too far away from February 10th. So we are literally sliding under the closing door of time on every one of these episodes in season
Don't
1.
forget your indie hat on the other side. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, we are literally snatching the episode back from across the door before our arms get crushed. So every single episode is just sliding in under the deadline. So it's a fun challenge, and that's so. Yeah, when I say the animators are taking a break, that's like a group of 18 people who are, done making the performances
Actually doing the
that you
motion
see.
then. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we break it apart, and then the background painters are just about done. They're moving on to doing development for season two. We are greenlit for season two, so we're moving
Wonderful.
on that. A greenlit to a degree, yeah. I mean, we've raised the money for development for pre-production, so we got new characters, new locations. Going to be improving our tech a little bit, stepping up our games. Some things that you're allowed to do in a game engine that are really powerful. We can kind of borrow those systems. We just didn't have the bandwidth or the time to do them in season one, so we kind of just did kind of adapted things the old-fashioned way to a certain degree. But season two, we can start leveraging some more of those technological hacks that work better for us. As far as like Angel Studios and stuff like that, yeah, we're really scrambling to get. The show is doing really really well so far as initial metrics of what expectations are. We got half the episodes out right now for season one. It's not really a strong push. We're kind of like just getting it there, getting the core people worked out. They're doing a lot of A/B testing about what works for viewer retention and stuff, deep analytic, googly things, because it's a streaming service. So they're one of the backside of that is you get data about what works and what doesn't. So it's doing really well. They say it's tracking better than The Chosen did when it first started. So they're happy. We're happy with it. And they're like, when can we have season two? And we're like, we're working on it. So yeah, we are. We're hard at work on pre-production on that. If all goes well, we start principal animation on that. Well, actually, we'll start first with cinematography layout, probably in March. We have animatics, which is basically the comic book version of the show, um, up and working for the first 5 episodes. Season two will be 7 episodes instead of 6. So, and we hope to have those out, in the fourth quarter of this year and stuff like
Okay.
that. So,
Wow.
um, yeah, we're cooking right along, and we're looking at ways to try and secure the funding we need to keep going. Because the grand plan of Wingfeather Saga is to take 7 seasons to tell the story of the 4 books. So we have that all mapped out, as far as like a breakout, what happens in each season, and we have episode breakouts. So we've done the work already of just taking the 4 books and breaking them down into what it means across 7 seasons to make a show that follows that narrative arc all the way through. And so that's our goals. We just want to get to the point where we can finish the 7 seasons and get it out there and let it do what it does.
This is spectacular. We haven't talked much even about the voice talent of the show, but I thought that Podo Helmer sounded a little familiar, so I looked him up. It's an actor named Kevin McNally, who actually is Gibbs, the pirate from Pirates of the Caribbean. So my
wow.
voice actor talent, which by the way now covers Japanese voice actors as well, was able to help me again.
Excellent.
And then, of course, Jodie Benson, famous for voicing the Little Mermaid and many, many other characters, as the voice of Nia. So you'll detect some familiar tones there. I'm really looking forward to this. I noticed too about the animation style, and we haven't talked as much about the style in particular, but it looks like a watercolor-ish illustration. It actually looks like the new editions of the books themselves. The kind of some synchronizing there. It's a lower frame rate than you would expect for animation. What is this? What people would say the standard is? Is it 24 frames per second?
Yeah.
Okay. What's the frame rate for it? Yeah, it's a little bit different.
It's right around 12. It's back to old school, 2D animation from the 40 before CG. Before CG, animation was rarely done on ones. We call it ones because there's 24 frames of film, and so doing it on ones means that you do a new drawing every frame for every second because it's expensive. So if you go back to old Disney films or the Warner Brothers cartoons or anything, that's basically before computer graphics really took over. It was very rare to find animation done on ones. Most of the time, it was done on twos, which means you do a drawing and you take 2 pictures of it in on film, so that when it plays back at 12 frames per second, practically. And so, kind of leaning into that, and you see that a lot in stop motion as well, just because it's just easier to do. But now with a lot of the computer assisted stop motion stuff, that's all done on ones as well. So there's been this the last 20 something years, because of the advent of computer graphics, and just that style has become a really big thing. We said, hey, let's harken back to something a little deeper in history, go back a few years. And it was viable then because, the story of Pinocchio is compelling, even though it's on twos, right? The story of Sleeping Beauty is compelling, even though it's on twos. I grew up, a fan of Bugs Bunny and the Warner Brother cartoons, and those are all on twos, right? So we know that you don't, frame rate doesn't equal quality. So
Right.
do we have a strong intentional philosophy of leaving gaps? Or the way I call it is, make the entire thing impressionistic. It's not realism. We're not trying to do hyper realism. We're not trying to represent reality with a high level of fidelity or accuracy. It's a fantasy series, so we want to invite the user's imagination to do some work. So when we paint the backgrounds, we do not, you know, render every leaf with high detail. We take a brushstroke and we say that's a tree. And if you look at the background paintings, you see the brushstrokes, you see the bristles, because we have an ethos in our show where we want to see the hand of the artist, because we think, I see the hand of the artist everywhere I look around me, and that's a great creation, right? I see God's hand in everything, and I don't want to hide the hand of our artists, who are wonderful, talented people, and hide it behind the polish of a machine. So we're trying everything we can to get the machine out of the way and let the artist's handprint come through. Um, so that you can distinguish, hey, if you really study, you can, and you understand it, you can, like, I can spot Aiden Peterson's backgrounds because they're a certain style. I can spot Trudy Wenzel's backgrounds because they're a style, but they're all on style, but they have their own little flair to them. I can pick out pieces of animation that one of our animators, Sinisha Matic, does, because Sinisha's got a style, and then Tom Stockinger has another style. Everybody has a style, like Sam Wilson has a style, and it comes through. It's all cohesive, but we're not trying to polish that away by leaving gaps in the pixels, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, not lovingly rendering everything to the nines where it's all presented to you. You have to do nothing except consume it. We're leaving gaps in motion. We're leaving gaps in lighting. We're leaving gaps in shading. We're leaving gaps in the backgrounds to make it an illustration, to invite the mind and the imagination of the user into every frame.
Yeah, I love that as that's a wonderful philosophy, and that style that you're using, that impressionistic, more of a classic animation style. I think for a lot of viewers, I grew up consuming all these Disney films as a kid, and now I'm a parent, and so it's got this nostalgic feeling to it, which also kind of correlates with more classic virtues and values. And so I think it's like right away I trusted it, oddly enough, as opposed to, like you said, the machine produced animation of today, where it's just so highly polished. But we've talked about Disney, we've talked about other Netflix and other streaming giants, and just a lot of the values and themes that they are embedding in their stories are not always consistent with the Christian worldview. So,
Sure.
I'm only a couple episodes into Wingfeather, but I can already see those threads of a Christian worldview and sort of the meaning behind it. But what would you say in this series is kind of stands out to you the most? Like, what's the most meaningful aspect of the story of the Wingfeather Saga?
It's honest is the best thing I can say. We're not trying to make safe entertainment here. There's that, that old line, when the kids ask about Aslan, is he safe? No. Oh, no, 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 he's not safe, but he's good. So we want to make something that's not necessarily safe. We're not interested in making something safe for the whole family. It's more like we want to make something good, resonantly, deeply good. And the stories are resonantly, deeply good. There are flawed characters all the way through this thing. Every one of our characters from hero on down is flawed. They make bad choices. They make legitimately terrible choices. They have skeletons in the closet. They have very, very dark pasts. Poto is a fascinating character. He's one of my favorites. Um, his past is, you're introduced to him as this kind of doting grandfather, and as you get deeper into the books, you realize, oh, this dude's done some things, right? And the choices that the boys make, and the thing is that they have scars, right? They have lasting consequences to their choices. Like, you choose to do this thing, and there's no getting back from that. Now, it's redeemed and it's made beautiful, but it's never made whole until something bigger can make it whole. You can go along with a broken heart in this world because sometimes you just have a broken heart, you know? So, and until it's all made new, you just got to deal with that. And that's what's honest about these stories is we're not trying to tell you a fanciful version of what a good Christian life looks like. We're not interested in that in the slightest bit. And Andrew wasn't either. And his songwriting is very similar. It's like, what does he call it? A sorrowful joy, you know? So that's the meaning thing for us. That's for me personally. That's super, super deep. That's why I care about making a show and making it beautiful because it's real. I've lived a while on this earth and I've seen some things and some stuff's happened to me. And I know how broken this place is, but it's still beautiful. So that's what's meaningful to me.
I love it.
As a famous songwriter has famously sung, do you feel the world is broken? Chorus answer, we do. And that sentiment, that biblical truth and beauty comes through in this show. I'm really looking forward to the rest of these episodes. Of course, I'm going to be reading the books and then looking forward to season 2, Lord willing. Lord willing, again, coming out hopefully later this year. So we're going to pray for you guys at your scrappy startup animation studio. Go to wingfeathersaga.com. We'll put all those links in the show notes. You can figure out how to support this effort as well. Like actually put your money where your fandom is. It's a great way of supporting this series, this new crowdsourced method of sponsoring these hardworking animators and artists doing this for your part for the Lord's glory. We're looking forward to it. Keith, thank you so much for stopping by the studio. We look forward to tracking the rest of this further up and further in, brother.
Great. Thank you. It's been awesome.
Stephen, one of the themes that really stood out to me from talking to Keith was this theme of sorrowful joy, that I know how broken this world is, but it's still beautiful. And I've already seen that again in the first 2 episodes of the show. And I'm sure my kids could talk all about this, that there are very dangerous and dark things and broken and twisted things in the world, but they're still beautiful and wonderful and glorious things that are still in creation and that we can find, and that we know that God is going to be bringing more and more of those into the world as he redeems it. And so it's sort of we're in this in-between state, right? With where we live. And the story perfectly captures that. And I think too, that this story really is in that middle space of, it's not overtly Christian, but it's very Christian informed. And we talked about this all the way back in episode 2 of this podcast. What do we mean by saying it's a Christian story? And we talked about 4 categories. It's a novel for Christians. It's a novel that's about Christianity for a wider audience. It's a novel that says Christianity is like this. It's more metaphorical, and it's not like overtly driven by Christian language. And I think that's where this is. And then there's kind of more of an outer circle. It's just, oh, this is just by a Christian, but it's basically just very general market, what you'd find anywhere else. I think this is very much in that third category, that this is something that really portrays a Christian worldview. And I like how he said it's not obviously Christian, but it's profoundly Christian. And I saw that right away, that this is a family that believes in God, that this is, they carry virtues and values that are very much in line with the Christian worldview. Yes, it's a world with dragons and magic and creatures. So it's not obviously, okay, this is not the 1st century AD. This is a very different story from The Chosen. And I love that Angel Studios is taking this on and taking on a very different kind of project. And I really just hope the fans of The Chosen, the fans of Narnia, will check out this story, because I think they're going to be very pleasantly surprised. So now let's go into the comm station. We got 2 notes after our news story titled Christian Fan Fiction Writers Bite Porn Exalt Salt and Light with New Tag on AO3. Detail 359 wrote, as a Christian and fan fiction writer, I'm so glad other Christians are doing this. Yes, it's going to incur some wrath from other groups, but Salt and Light isn't trying to force others to agree with them. They're just making a place where those who already do can congregate and share stories. I'm adding this tag to my works right now. And yes, I would agree with that. And I think that really is the difference in the world today, is that Christians are told if we just congregate, if we just meet and share our values, then somehow that's oppressing other people. And that's That's just nonsense. And then Kessie, a original Spec Fifth reader, wrote, "Dude, I am so joining this. I'm always wishing I had an easier way to find Christian fic writers and for them to find me," end quote. Well, I'm really glad to both of you to have found this. And I think, Stephen, can you tell us a little bit more about this news article you wrote and just some of the other responses to it?
Absolutely. Well, we have an in-house correspondent who keeps track with more of the fan fiction side of things, my wife, and she told me about this story, and she has enjoyed some fan fiction here and there, but of course, it is a perilous space. There's a lot of imaginations run amok on this site, AO3, which stands for Archive of Our Own. It's one of the biggest fan fiction sites out there, and you can write about anything, anything, anything. And there's a lot of then, shall we say, fantasization that goes on that is not only devoid of our values, but is blasphemous against the human nature. And that's just something you run into when you're going out to not only enjoy stories in the world, but try to make some of your own. And I think that statistically, folks who enjoy fantasy, Christian fans and otherwise, are more likely to attempt fan fiction, which includes crossovers. You know, you'll get the Pirates of the Caribbean meet the Hobbits from Lord of the Rings and all kinds of other crossovers, some pretty wacky, but apparently some really great art out there. And I'm unaware of other Christian efforts to kind of organize in this space and provide a distinctive label that means a particular set of standards, not necessarily, oh, this is a clean story. This is a wholesome story. You could have found it at the Lifeway Christian Bookstore in 2007. This Salt and Light tag really speaks to, I think, a more biblical identification with those words. Jesus himself talked about believers being salt and light in the world, with the caveats of the salt not losing its saltiness and the light not being smothered under a basket. This is not necessarily clean, wholesome stuff. It just means that these are going to be stories with a particular set of virtues, like redemptive value, not reveling in violence, violence serving a purpose, and certainly a more biblical understanding of marriage and relationships. I don't know the folks who've put this together. I just found out about them from my in-house correspondent. But I thought it'd be great to just give a little attention to more of what Keith was talking about. Christians acting in this, what do you call it, a middle space or an in-between space. It's not the church. It's not an evil environment. It's kind of the areas where those overlap. This is more about Christians doing subtle missionary work, seasoning the world, shining light into the world. And then if the Holy Spirit wants to move in next and bring some people directly to Jesus as a result, that's his business. Sometimes evangelism is overt, and sometimes it's more of a pre-evangelism or even a means of common grace in the world. God lets the ungodly enjoy rain and sunshine, and so should we, as much as we're gifted to do so. All right. We've had a lot of content at Lorehaven, including that news story about the Salt and Light tag at AO3. We've also got a review of Lander's Legacy, an antediluvian fantasy we posted last Friday. Coming up as well, we have an article from Elijah David. He's resuming his series about I'll Never Grow Too Old for Narnia. And his next article is called The Magician's Nephew Taught Me Christ's Compassion in the Midst of Grief. I will say that in reading and editing this piece, I developed a severe case of manly eyeball sweat. There's some really personal themes in here, and for those who've also undergone this suffering, that's something that you may really resonate with. Last week, we had Josiah DeGraff's article, How Christians Can Discern Jesus Adaptations in The Chosen and Other Stories. That started a lot of discussion, but we're going to have to save that for a future episode, if at all. This next Friday, we have a review coming out of another fantasy novel called A Crown of Chains. Meanwhile, in the Lorehaven Guild, our exclusive Discord community, this week we are finishing Prince Caspian, our first monthly book quest of the new year. Coming up in February, we're going to start a more romantical-ish fantasy just in time for Valentine's Day. Tisha is going to lead that in the guild, and it's called Rose, Petals, and Snowflakes. So if you're into that sort of thing, if you need some love and romance along with the fantasy, we've got you covered. How to get into the Lorehaven Guild? Just subscribe free to Lorehaven. You go to lorehaven.com, enter your email address, not given out or sold. We just send you the exclusive invite to the guild along with any updates about articles, podcasts, or reviews that you choose to receive free in your inbox. Next on Fantastical Truth, what if you were a blind young man living in medieval times and you are called to a special and future mythological mission to become the wizard Merlin. Robert Trescollard's fantasy Merlin Spiral series has been reforged into audiobook form. Next week, Sir Robert himself gallops into the studio to share more about his medieval fantasy, roundtables, knights of yore, and the wonderful king reigning over them all. Next week on Fantastical Truth. Meanwhile, you are an animator. Well, not necessarily, but you do create motion in the world. It's wonderful to hear about Keith Lango and all these other animators who are able to make these amazing images adapting the Andrew Peterson series. Just note that, as Andrew Peterson himself says in Adorning the Dark, everyone is creative. Everyone is gifted by God to make stuff using God's stuff. It's not just for evangelism, although that is also great, but most of all, it is to glorify our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the true hero, by the way, who conquers all of the fangs of dang in your life. I love remembering that truth as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.